Jake Thompson wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his horse through the rocky canyon. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, and his water supply was running dangerously low. He had been tracking stolen cattle for 3 days, following faint hoofprints that led deeper into Apache territory. Most men would have turned back by now, but Jake was stubborn, and the cattle meant everything to his struggling ranch. The canyon walls rose high on either side, casting long shadows that provided brief moments of relief from the scorching heat. Jake's horse, a sturdy bay mare named Belle, snorted nervously. Her ears swiveled constantly, picking up sounds that Jake's human senses couldn't detect. Something was wrong. As they rounded a bend in the canyon, Jake pulled Belle to a halt. There, huddled against the red sandstone wall, were 3 young Apache girls. They couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 years old. Their clothes were torn and dusty, and they looked terrified. More importantly, they were alone in this desolate place, miles from any known Apache settlement. Jake dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. He had learned enough Apache customs during his years in the territory to know that sudden movements could be misinterpreted. The girls pressed themselves closer to the wall, their dark eyes wide with fear. The oldest of the 3, a girl with intricate braided hair, stepped protectively in front of the other 2. "Easy there," Jake said softly, though he doubted they understood English. "I'm not going to hurt you." He noticed something unusual about the girls. Each of them bore distinctive markings on their faces and arms. They weren't tattoos, but rather painted symbols that seemed to tell a story. Jake had seen similar markings before, but never quite like these. The patterns were more complex, more detailed, as if they carried special significance. The oldest girl spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice trembling. Jake caught a few words that sounded like warnings. She pointed repeatedly toward the deeper part of the canyon, then back at Jake, shaking her head vigorously. Jake looked in the direction she was pointing and felt a chill despite the heat. Smoke was rising in thin wisps from somewhere beyond the next ridge. It was too controlled to be a wildfire, which meant people were out there. Given the girls' obvious terror, Jake suspected those people weren't friendly. The rocky passage led them through a maze of narrow corridors and hidden chambers that Jake never would have imagined existed. The oldest Apache girl, who had begun to communicate through gestures that her name sounded like Ayana, moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had traveled these secret routes before. Her 2 companions, younger girls who seemed to be sisters, followed close behind. As they emerged from the labyrinth onto a high ledge overlooking the valley, Jake got his first clear view of their pursuers. 6 men on horseback were spread out across the canyon floor, searching systematically. Their leader, a tall man with a distinctive black hat, was directing the search with military precision. Jake recognized him now, Dutch Morrison, a notorious bounty hunter who worked for whoever paid the highest price. Ayana touched Jake's arm and pointed to the markings on her left forearm. The symbols there depicted a series of connected caves and underground passages. She traced a route with her finger that led from their current position to a place marked with a symbol that looked like a star surrounded by smaller circles. Jake studied the markings more carefully, comparing them to the landscape visible below. The accuracy was remarkable. Every ridge, every watercourse, every significant landmark was represented in the intricate patterns painted on the girl's skin. But there was more than just geography here. Some symbols appeared to indicate times of day or seasons, suggesting that certain routes were only safe at specific times. The sound of voices drifted up from below. Dutch Morrison was questioning someone. Another Apache. From the sound of it, Jake couldn't make out the words, but the tone was threatening. The bounty hunter had found a local guide, probably by force. Ayana gestured urgently toward a narrow trail that led down the backside of the ridge. They needed to move quickly before Morrison's men expanded their search pattern. As they began their descent, Jake noticed that Ayana was consulting the markings on her arm like a compass, checking their direction against the painted symbols. The trail was treacherous, barely wide enough for single-file movement. One wrong step would send them tumbling down a 50-foot drop onto jagged rocks. But the Apache girls moved with practiced ease, their soft moccasins finding secure footing on surfaces that would challenge an experienced mountain climber. As they descended, Jake began to piece together more of the story. These weren't ordinary Apache girls. The complexity and accuracy of their markings suggested they were daughters or granddaughters of important tribal leaders, possibly medicine women or keepers of sacred geographical knowledge. That would explain why Morrison was so determined to capture them specifically. The markings weren't just practical maps. They were cultural treasures, containing centuries of accumulated knowledge about surviving in this harsh landscape. In the wrong hands, such information could be used to track down Apache camps, locate water sources that tribes depended on, and identify safe passages that had been kept secret for generations. Halfway down the ridge, they reached a small cave hidden behind a curtain of desert brush. Ayanna led them inside, and Jake was amazed to discover that it was much larger than it appeared from the outside. The cave extended deep into the hillside, with several chambers connected by natural passages. In the main chamber, ancient paintings covered the walls, similar symbols to those on the girl's skin, but older and more faded. This was clearly a sacred place, used by Apache ancestors to record important information about the land. The girls were living guardians of this ancient knowledge, carrying it with them wherever they went. Ayanna knelt beside a small pool of water that had collected in a natural depression in the cave floor. She cupped her hands and drank, then offered water to her companions and to Jake. The water was cool and sweet, fed by an underground spring. Jake realized that this cave was marked on Ayanna's arm, one of the small circles that indicated a reliable water source. As they rested in the cave, Jake tried to communicate more effectively with the girls, using a combination of basic Apache words, hand gestures, and drawings scratched in the sandy floor. He began to understand their situation. The girls were not just random captives. They had been traveling to a sacred gathering of tribes when Morrison's men had attacked their party. Their escorts had been killed or scattered, leaving the girls alone with their precious cargo of geographical knowledge. Morrison had been specifically hunting for them because someone had told him about their markings and what they represented. Jake's suspicions about Eastern investors seemed to be correct. Someone with money and influence was gathering intelligence about Apache territory, probably planning a major operation that would require detailed knowledge of water sources, safe passages, and tribal movements. The girls' markings were worth a fortune to such people, but there was something else. Ayanna kept pointing to a particular symbol on her shoulder, a complex design that looked like overlapping circles with radiating lines. She repeated a word that Jake didn't recognize, but her tone suggested it was extremely important. The other two girls became excited whenever she mentioned this symbol, nodding and speaking rapidly in their own language. Jake studied the symbol more carefully. Unlike the geographical markings, this one seemed to represent something else entirely. The radiating lines reminded him of light reflecting off metal, and the overlapping circles could be seen as coins or precious objects. Could this symbol mark the location of something valuable? Gold, silver, or precious stones? The pieces were starting to fit together. If the Apache had discovered valuable minerals in their territory, that would explain the Eastern investors' sudden interest. It would also explain why Morrison was willing to go to such lengths to capture these specific girls. Their markings might not just show water sources and trails. They might reveal the location of a significant mineral deposit. As the sun began to set, Jake knew they couldn't stay in the cave much longer. Morrison's men would eventually find their trail, and this location would become a trap rather than a refuge. They needed to keep moving, but where could they go? Ayanna seemed to read his thoughts. She stood and moved to another section of the cave wall, where more recent paintings had been added to the ancient ones. These newer symbols appeared to show a route leading away from the immediate area, crossing several days' worth of terrain to reach a destination marked with the same radiating circle symbol that appeared on her shoulder. She traced the route with her finger, then looked at Jake expectantly. She was proposing a journey, a long, dangerous trek through Apache territory to reach whatever location was marked by that special symbol. It would mean days of travel through hostile terrain, pursued by Morrison's men, with limited supplies, and the constant risk of encountering other Apache tribes who might not be friendly to a white man. But Jake was beginning to understand that this journey might be their only hope. If the symbol marked something truly valuable, it could provide the leverage needed to deal with Morrison and his employers. More importantly, it might be the key to exposing the larger conspiracy that had led to the cattle theft and his pursuit into the canyon. The sound of horses outside the cave made them all freeze. Morrison's men had found their trail. Jake could hear voices getting closer, along with the scraping sound of someone climbing the rocky slope toward their hiding place. Jake motioned for the girls to move toward the back of the cave, where Ayanna had indicated another passage led deeper into the hillside. As they gathered their few possessions, Jake checked his ammunition again. Still 6 bullets, but he was hoping to avoid a fight in the confines of the cave. The voices outside were getting louder. Jake could make out individual words now. Morrison was directing his men to search every possible hiding place. They knew the fugitives were somewhere in this area, and they weren't going to give up easily. Ayanna led them through a narrow passage at the back of the cave that Jake hadn't noticed before. The opening was barely visible, hidden behind a natural rock formation that created an optical illusion. As they squeezed through the gap, Jake marveled at the Apache knowledge of this terrain. Every cave, every passage, every hiding place was known and remembered, passed down through generations of survival in harsh conditions. The passage led to another cave system that extended even deeper into the hillside. Here, the walls were covered with more recent markings, symbols that appeared to be messages left by other Apache travelers. Ayanna studied these carefully, reading them like a newspaper to gather information about recent events in the area. She pointed to one set of symbols and spoke urgently to her companions. From their expressions, the news wasn't good. Jake gathered that other Apache groups in the area had been attacked or captured, and Morrison's men weren't the only threat they faced. But there was also hopeful news. Ayanna traced another set of symbols that seemed to indicate safe passage to the south, where tribal allies could provide protection. The route would take them through difficult terrain, but it offered the possibility of reaching Apache territory that was still under tribal control. As they prepared to leave the cave system through another hidden exit, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He took out his own knife and approached Ayanna, pointing to his arm and then to her markings. He wanted her to copy some of the crucial symbols onto his skin. Ayanna looked surprised, then thoughtful. After a moment of consideration, she nodded. Using a piece of charcoal from an old fire pit in the cave, she began to trace key symbols onto Jake's forearm. The process was careful and deliberate. She was choosing only the most important markings, the ones that would be essential for survival. As she worked, Jake realized he was being inducted into an ancient tradition. He was becoming a keeper of Apache geographical knowledge, trusted with secrets that had been guarded for generations. The responsibility was both humbling and terrifying. The sound of voices echoing through the cave system reminded them that time was running out. Morrison's men had entered the caves and were searching systematically. In a few minutes, they would find the hidden passage. Ayanna finished her work and stepped back to examine the symbols now decorating Jake's arm. She nodded with satisfaction, then pointed to the cave exit and spoke a single word in Apache that Jake somehow understood meant, "Ready." They emerged from the caves onto the far side of the ridge just as the last light was fading from the western sky. The landscape ahead was rugged and unforgiving, but the markings on Jake's arm now provided a roadmap through the wilderness. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that this journey was about more than simple survival. The symbols that Ayanna had copied onto his skin included the special radiating circle design from her shoulder. Whatever that symbol represented, she had decided that he needed to know about it too. Their partnership had evolved from a simple rescue into something much more significant, a shared quest to reach the location marked by that mysterious symbol. As they began their night journey across the desert, Jake looked back once at the caves where they had hidden. Morrison's torchlight was visible in the darkness, still searching, but the bounty hunter was now following a cold trail, while his quarry moved forward toward a destination that promised answers to all the questions that had brought them together. The markings on Jake's arm felt strange and wonderful, like carrying a piece of ancient wisdom that connected him to the land in a way he had never experienced before. The Apache girls had shared more than just information with him. They had shared their trust, their culture, and their hope for the future. Somewhere ahead in the darkness lay the place marked by the radiating circle symbol. Whatever they found there would determine not just their own fate, but possibly the future of the entire territory. Jake touched the markings on his arm and followed Ayanna into the night, knowing that his life had changed forever. 3 days of hard travel through the desert had tested everyone's limits. Jake's water supply was nearly exhausted, and even the Apache girls, despite their knowledge of hidden springs marked on their skin, were showing signs of strain. The markings on Jake's arm had proven invaluable. Twice they had saved the group from taking wrong turns that would have led them into dead ends or dangerous terrain. Dutch Morrison and his men had followed relentlessly, never more than a few hours behind. Jake could see their dust on the horizon each morning, a persistent reminder that their pursuers had superior numbers and supplies. Only the Apache girls' intimate knowledge of the terrain had kept them ahead of capture. On the third evening, as they crested a rocky ridge, Ayanna suddenly stopped and pointed ahead with obvious excitement. In the distance, Jake could see their destination, a distinctive rock formation that matched exactly the radiating circle symbol now etched on his arm. The formation consisted of several tall stone pillars arranged in a rough circle, with a larger central spire that caught the last rays of the setting sun. But they weren't alone. As they approached the rock formation, Jake spotted movement in the shadows between the stone pillars. Other people were already there, Apache warriors, from their dress and weapons. Ayanna saw them too, and spoke rapidly to her companions. The younger girls looked both relieved and nervous. Ayanna turned to Jake and spoke a mixture of Apache and broken English, explaining that these were members of her extended family, uncles and cousins who had been searching for the 3 girls since the attack on their traveling party. Her words carried both gratitude for Jake's protection and concern about how the warriors might react to finding her with a white man. As they descended toward the rock formation, Jake could see the Apache warriors more clearly. There were 8 of them, all well-armed and obviously experienced fighters. Their leader, an older man with silver hair and intricate facial markings, watched Jake's approach with calculating eyes. Ayanna called out to the warriors in Apache, her voice carrying across the desert air. The response was immediate. Several warriors stood and moved toward them, hands resting on their weapons but not yet drawn. The silver-haired leader remained seated, waiting. When they reached the camp, Ayanna immediately went to the older warrior and spoke at length in rapid Apache, gesturing frequently toward Jake. The man listened without expression, his dark eyes studying Jake intently. The other warriors formed a loose circle around them, ready for trouble but not yet hostile. After several minutes of discussion, the leader stood and approached Jake directly. He was tall and imposing, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. When he spoke, it was in surprisingly good English. "I am called Joseph Running Bear," he said. "Ayanna tells me you saved my daughter and her cousins from the men who hunt for bounty money. This is a debt of honor." Jake felt relief wash over him. "I'm Jake Thompson. I was just doing what was right." Running Bear nodded slowly. "Ayanna also tells me you carry the old knowledge now." He pointed to the markings on Jake's arm. "These are not given lightly to outsiders. She must trust you greatly." "I hope I'm worthy of that trust," Jake replied honestly. Running Bear studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the central area of the rock formation. "Come. There is much you must understand before the sun rises again." As they walked between the towering stone pillars, Jake began to grasp the true significance of this place. The rocks themselves were covered with ancient carvings, symbols similar to those on the Apache girl's skin, but clearly much older. This wasn't just a landmark or a meeting place. It was a repository of knowledge, a library carved in stone that had preserved Apache geographical and cultural information for centuries. Running Bear led them to the central spire, where the rock formations created a natural amphitheater. Here, sheltered from wind and hidden from outside view, the Apache had built a small but permanent settlement. There were carefully constructed fire pits, storage areas carved into the rock, and sleeping spaces arranged around the central area. "This place has been sacred to our people for more generations than memory holds," Running Bear explained. "The knowledge kept here has helped us survive in this land when others could not. But now that knowledge is threatened." He gestured to Ayanna and her companions, who had joined a group of other Apache women around one of the fire pits. "These girls carry part of the old knowledge in the markings on their skin, But they also carry something new. Information about the white men who seek to take our land. Jake felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Morrison and his employers. They're not just collecting bounty money. They're gathering intelligence. Yes, Running Bear confirmed. The men who sent the bounty hunters have discovered something in our territory that they want very badly. They believe the old knowledge will help them find it. What kind of something? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew. Running Bear was quiet for a moment, studying Jake's face in the flickering firelight. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. Come. I will show you why this place is truly sacred, and why the white men's greed threatens everything my people have built. He led Jake to a section of the rock formation where the stone pillars created a narrow entrance. Beyond the entrance lay a hidden valley, completely enclosed by towering rock walls, and in that valley, reflecting the light of the rising moon, lay something that took Jake's breath away. Water. Not just a spring or a small pond, but a substantial lake fed by underground sources. The water was crystal clear, surrounded by green vegetation that created a hidden oasis in the middle of the desert. But that wasn't all. Along the shores of the lake, Jake could see the glint of metal veins running through exposed rock faces. Silver, Running Bear said simply. And some gold. Enough to make men rich. If they could find it and transport it, Jake whistled low. And the markings on Ayana's skin, they show the location of this place. Among other things, the old knowledge includes not just the location of the silver, but the water sources needed to work it, the safe passages needed to transport it, and the seasonal patterns needed to avoid conflicts with other tribes. So Morrison's employers aren't just after the silver. They need the complete information to make it profitable. Running Bear nodded grimly. Without the knowledge carried by our daughters, this would just be another desert valley that no white man could find or survive in long enough to matter. But with that knowledge, Jake understood, with the detailed geographical information carried by the Apache girls, an organized mining operation could establish itself in the hidden valley, extract the precious metals, and transport them safely through hostile territory. The markings on their skin weren't just cultural treasures. They were the key to a fortune. What happens now? Jake asked. Before Running Bear could answer, the sound of horses echoing off the canyon walls announced the arrival of unwelcome visitors. Morrison and his men had finally tracked them to the sacred site. They cannot be allowed to leave here with knowledge of this place, Running Bear said quietly. His tone was matter of fact, but Jake understood the implications. The Apache warriors were prepared to fight to the death to protect their secrets. There might be another way, Jake said quickly. Morrison knows I was tracking stolen cattle when this whole thing started. What if those cattle are still out there somewhere? Running Bear looked puzzled, so Jake explained his theory. The cattle theft was probably a setup to lure me into Apache territory, where Morrison could deal with me quietly. But if we could find those cattle, and if they're marked with Morrison's brand, or that of his employers, you could prove they committed the theft, Running Bear finished. White man's law would punish them, and their credibility would be destroyed. Exactly. And without Morrison providing intelligence, his employers would have a much harder time finding this place or making use of what they learn. The sound of voices was getting closer. Morrison's men were calling out, demanding that Jake surrender and turn over the Apache girls. There wasn't much time. Running Bear spoke rapidly to his warriors in Apache, and Jake caught enough words to understand that they were discussing strategy. Some wanted to fight immediately, while others were interested in Jake's alternative plan. Ayana approached and spoke to her father, pointing to the markings on her arm, and then to Jake. She traced one particular symbol, a pattern that looked like converging lines with small rectangles scattered along them. Cattle trails, Jake realized. She's showing cattle trails. Running Bear translated as Ayana continued, pointing to different symbols. She says the white men's cattle were driven through 3 different hidden passes, following routes that only we know. The cattle are being held in a box canyon 2 days' ride from here, guarded by men wearing the same clothing as the bounty hunters. Jake felt excitement building. If we can get to those cattle and prove they're stolen, We can turn the tables on Morrison. Instead of us running from him, he'll be running from the law. But first we must escape from here without revealing the location of the Silver Valley," Running Bear pointed out. Ayanna spoke again, this time pointing to a complex series of symbols that covered most of her left shoulder. As she traced the patterns, Jake began to see what she was proposing. There was another way out of the rock formation, a route that would take them through underground passages and emerge several miles away. "The old escape routes," Running Bear said with admiration. "I had forgotten that she carries knowledge of those as well." The plan came together quickly. The Apache warriors would create a diversion, making Morrison think that Jake and the girls were hiding somewhere in the main part of the rock formation. Meanwhile, Jake and a small group would use the secret passages to escape unseen. Once they reached the hidden cattle, they could gather evidence and then alert the territorial authorities. As they prepared to leave, Running Bear approached Jake one final time. "The markings on your arm make you a keeper of our secrets now, if you betray that trust." "I won't," Jake said firmly. "This land has been home to your people for centuries. I have no right to take that away." Running Bear studied his face and nodded. "I believe you. But remember, the knowledge you carry is dangerous. Others will want it, and they will not be as honorable as you claim to be." Ayanna led Jake and two young Apache warriors into a hidden cave entrance at the base of the central spire. The passage beyond was narrow and winding, clearly carved by underground water flow over countless years. As they moved through the darkness, Jake could hear Morrison's voice echoing from the surface above, demanding answers and threatening violence. The underground route took them through several miles of tunnels and caves, before emerging in a desert wash several ridges away from the sacred site. By the time they reached the surface, the sun was rising, and they could see smoke from the rock formation where Morrison's men were probably still searching. Following the markings on Ayanna's arm, they traveled for 2 days through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without the detailed geographical knowledge she carried. Jake was constantly amazed by the accuracy of the symbols. Every water source, every safe passage, every landmark was exactly where the markings indicated it would be. On the second evening, they reached the box canyon, where the stolen cattle were being held. Jake could see his own brand on several of the animals, along with brands from neighboring ranches. More importantly, he could see that some of the cattle had been rebranded with a mark he didn't recognize, probably belonging to Morrison's employers. The guards were sloppy, clearly not expecting anyone to find the remote location. Jake and the Apache warriors were able to approach close enough to gather detailed information about the operation. There were 6 men guarding nearly 200 head of cattle, and from their conversation, Jake learned that they were planning to drive the herd east to railroad towns where the cattle could be sold without questions being asked. But the real prize came when Jake recognized one of the guards as Tom Bradshaw, a man who worked for the Eastern Development Company that had been pressuring local ranchers to sell their land. The connection between the cattle theft and the land grab was now clear and provable. Working together, Jake and the Apache warriors developed a plan to capture Bradshaw and gather evidence, while allowing the other guards to escape and spread word of their defeat. The plan worked perfectly. Within hours, they had Bradshaw tied up and talking, eager to avoid Apache vengeance by cooperating with Jake. The information Bradshaw provided was even more valuable than Jake had hoped. The Eastern Company had been systematically stealing cattle, pressuring ranchers with debt, and gathering intelligence about Apache territory for months. Morrison was just one part of a larger operation designed to clear white settlers and Apache tribes from land that the company wanted for mining operations. When Jake finally returned to town with Bradshaw as his prisoner, driving the recovered cattle before him, the revelation caused a sensation. The territorial authorities arrested Morrison and several other members of his gang, and the Eastern Development Company found itself facing serious legal challenges to their land claims. But for Jake, the most important moment came when he had to decide what to do with the markings on his arm. The Apache knowledge he now carried could make him wealthy if he chose to use it. He knew the location of silver deposits, water sources, and safe passages that others would pay handsomely to learn. Instead, he chose to honor the trust that Ayanna and her people had placed in him. Using his reward money from recovering the stolen cattle, he purchased supplies and delivered them to Running Bear's people, as a gesture of gratitude and respect. The markings on his arm gradually faded as the charcoal pigment wore away, but the memory of what they represented remained permanently etched in his mind and heart. Jake's ranch prospered, not because of secret knowledge about silver deposits, but because the Apache shared their understanding of water sources and seasonal patterns that helped him manage his land more effectively. The relationship between his ranch and the Apache community became a model for peaceful coexistence that other settlers began to follow. Years later, when Eastern prospectors finally discovered the silver deposits in Apache territory through their own efforts, they found that the tribal leaders were prepared to negotiate fair agreements for mineral rights. The ancient knowledge that had once been threatened was now being used to ensure that both Apache and white communities could benefit from the land's resources. Ayanna grew up to become a respected leader among her people, bridging the gap between traditional knowledge and the modern world. She never forgot the cowboy who had chosen protection over profit, and occasionally she would visit Jake's ranch to share stories and maintain the friendship that had begun with desperate flight through desert canyons. The markings that had once decorated her skin became the foundation for maps and documents that helped establish fair boundaries between Apache territory and settler lands. The knowledge that Morrison had tried to steal through force was eventually shared voluntarily, creating prosperity for everyone involved. Jake often reflected on the words he had shouted that first day in the canyon. "I'll take them, now." He had meant it as a declaration of protection, but it had become something much more. He had taken responsibility not just for 3 frightened girls, but for bridging 2 cultures and proving that trust and respect could accomplish what greed and violence could not. The sacred rock formation remained a secret place, known only to the Apache and to Jake. On quiet evenings, when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain, Jake would look toward the distant mountains and remember the hidden valley, where silver veins caught moonlight, and ancient wisdom had taught him that some treasures were too valuable to be measured in gold. He tried to communicate using the few Apache words he knew, mixed with hand gestures. The girls seemed to understand that he was asking what was wrong, but their rapid responses were far beyond his limited vocabulary. Frustrated, Jake pulled out his water canteen and offered it to them. The youngest girl reached for it eagerly, but the oldest knocked her hand away. Still suspicious, Jake set the canteen on the ground and backed away, showing his empty hands. After a moment's hesitation, the oldest girl picked up the water and allowed the others to drink. It was then that Jake got his first clear look at their markings. The patterns weren't random decorations. They appeared to be maps of some kind, with lines and symbols that corresponded to geographical features. Jake's pulse quickened as he recognized some of the landmarks depicted on their skin. These weren't just ceremonial markings. They were directions, carefully encoded information about locations in the surrounding territory. The sound of horses approaching made all 4 of them freeze. The Apache girls immediately began backing away, their fear turning to panic. Jake strained his ears and counted at least 6 horses, moving at a steady pace toward their location. From the girls' reactions, these weren't rescuers. "Stay behind me," Jake whispered. Though he knew they couldn't understand. He drew his rifle from its holster and checked the ammunition. 6 bullets left. If trouble was coming, he was going to face it head on. The oldest Apache girl grabbed his arm and shook her head frantically. She pointed to a narrow crevice in the canyon wall that Jake hadn't noticed before. It looked barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it might provide escape route. She was trying to tell him something important, but the approaching hoofbeats were getting louder. Jake made a quick decision. Whatever was coming, these girls were more afraid of it than they were of him. That told him everything he needed to know about whose side he should be on. He grabbed Belle's reins and gestured for the girls to follow him toward the crevice. The oldest girl hesitated for a moment, studying Jake's face as if trying to determine whether she could trust this strange white man. Something in his eyes must have convinced her, because she nodded and spoke quickly to the other 2. They began moving toward the narrow opening in the rock. As Jake helped the youngest girl into the crevice, he caught sight of the markings on her arm again. One of the symbols looked remarkably like the rock formation where they were hiding. Another resembled the distinctive double peak he could see in the distance. These markings weren't just decorative. They were a detailed map of the entire region. The The sound of voices echoed off the canyon walls. Jake could make out at least 3 different men speaking in English, their tones harsh and demanding. They were looking for something, or someone, from their crude language and aggressive manner. Jake pegged them as bounty hunters, or worse. "Search every crack in these rocks," one voice commanded. "Those girls can't have gotten far. The army's paying good money for Apache prisoners, and I intend to collect." Jake's blood ran cold. These men were slave hunters, capturing Apache children to sell to unscrupulous military officials who needed prisoners to justify their campaigns. It was a practice that turned Jake's stomach, even though he had no particular love for the Apache tribe that had raided his neighbors' ranches. The youngest Apache girl whimpered softly, and the oldest immediately placed a gentle hand over her mouth. They were all pressed together in the narrow crevice now, barely breathing. Jake could hear the men dismounting, their heavy boots crunching on the rocky ground. "Check over there," another voice called out. "I saw something moving near those boulders." Jake gripped his rifle tighter. If they were discovered, he would have to fight. 3 armed men against 1 cowboy, and 3 terrified girls weren't good odds. But he had faced worse. The problem was that any gunfight would likely result in the girls getting hurt, and he was beginning to realize that they might be more important than he had initially thought. The markings on their skin could be the key to finding something valuable in this harsh landscape. Water sources, hidden trails, maybe even the location of Apache camps. Information like that could be worth a fortune to the right people, or it could save a man's life if he was lost in the desert. Jake Thompson. The sound of his own name being called made him start. One of the men knew who he was. "We know you're out there, Thompson. We saw your tracks leading into this canyon. Hand over those Apache girls, and we'll let you ride away with no trouble." The oldest Apache girl looked at Jake with new understanding in her eyes. She had heard his name and realized that these men were specifically hunting for him as well as for them. Whatever was happening here was bigger than a simple slave hunting expedition. Jake closed his eyes and tried to think. How did these men know his name? How did they know he was in the canyon? Unless someone had been watching him from the beginning, tracking his movements as he followed the stolen cattle. The cattle theft might have been a setup, designed to lure him into Apache territory where he could be dealt with quietly. "Thompson." The voice called again, closer now. "We know about your ranch, your debts. We can make you a rich man, or we can make you a dead man. Your choice." The pieces were starting to fit together. Jake's ranch was indeed struggling financially. He owed money to several creditors in town, and there had been rumors that some Eastern investors were interested in buying up failed ranches for their mineral rights. Men like these bounty hunters were often employed to encourage stubborn ranchers to sell. But that still didn't explain why they wanted the Apache girls specifically. Unless the markings on their skin contained information that was valuable to these Eastern interests. Maybe the locations of water sources that could support mining operations, or safe passages through hostile territory. The oldest girl tugged at Jake's sleeve and pointed to her own markings, then to the canyon walls around them. She traced one of the symbols with her finger, then pointed to a specific rock formation visible through the narrow opening. She was trying to show him how to read the map on her skin. Jake studied the markings more carefully. The symbol she had traced looked like a series of connected lines with small circles at various points. As he looked at the actual landscape, he began to see the pattern. The lines represented water courses, and the circles marked springs or water holes. It was a detailed map of every reliable water source in the region. In a land where water meant life or death, such information was incredibly valuable. A mining company could use it to plan operations. An army could use it to track Apache movements. A rancher could use it to find grazing land for his cattle. These girls weren't just prisoners. They were walking treasure maps. "I'm losing patience, Thompson." The voice was much closer now. Maybe 50 yards away. "Come out now, or we start shooting up this whole canyon. Come out now. Come out now. Come out now. Come out now." Jake made his decision. He turned to the oldest Apache girl and whispered, "I'll take them." He pointed to her and the other 2 girls. Then to himself, "I'll take them. Now." The girl's eyes widened in surprise. She had expected him to abandon them to save himself. Instead, this strange cowboy was choosing to protect them, even though it meant facing armed men with the odds stacked against him. She nodded slowly and spoke rapidly to the other two girls. They looked frightened but determined. Whatever she told them, they were ready to trust Jake with their lives. Jake checked his rifle one more time and took a deep breath. The markings on these girls' skin had suddenly become the key to his survival, and theirs. If he could get them to safety, the information they carried might be valuable enough to solve his financial problems and expose the men who were trying to steal his land. The sound of boots on rock was getting closer. Jake could hear the men spreading out, searching methodically. In a few minutes, they would find the crevice. It was time to move. He gestured for the girls to follow him deeper into the narrow passage. The opening led to a series of connected crevices that wound through the canyon wall like a natural maze. If they could navigate it correctly, they might emerge on the other side of the ridge, well away from their pursuers. The oldest girl took the lead, moving with the confidence of someone who knew this territory. She guided them through twists and turns that Jake would never have noticed, following a route that seemed to be mapped out in her memory as clearly as the symbols on her skin. As they moved through the rocky labyrinth, Jake began to understand that rescuing these girls was about more than simple human decency. The knowledge they carried could change everything. For him, for the territory, and for the ongoing conflict between settlers and Apache tribes. Behind them, he could hear the bounty hunters shouting in frustration as they discovered the empty crevice. They would follow soon enough, but Jake was no longer just running away. He was running toward something, a chance to turn the tables on the men who had tried to trap him, using the ancient knowledge carried by 3 brave Apache girls who had chosen to trust a cowboy with their lives. The afternoon sun was beginning to angle lower in the sky, and Jake knew they needed to find shelter before nightfall. But first, he had to learn how to read the living maps that these girls carried on their skin. Their survival, and his revenge, depended on it.